The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, was considered by some experts the bloodiest civil war before the 20th century. It was a rebellion not only against the current regime and the governing dynasty, but it was a war also fueled by religious beliefs, anger, and pride. A total of 20 million people lost their lives during the 14-year war, and hence caused this event to go down in China's history as one of the most destructive epidemics ever. The instigator of the rebellion was Hong Chi-kwan, and leader of the rebelling Taipings and self-proclaimed brother of Jesus. Together, Hong and his followers proceeded to march ever northwards towards the Qing capital, Peking, where due to a series of internal problems and military defeats, along with a Qing military reform and Western influence, they essentially marched towards their demise. The origins of the rebellion are a mixture of natural, economic, and eventually social problems. The flashpoint was not a disaster necessarily, but would in turn lead to one. China's population had doubled from 150 million to around 300 million people in a very short period of time. This inevitably caused shortages in food and land. This, in turn, caused prices to skyrocket, and on top of the shortages of food, the new Qing dynasty, already disliked for being a dynasty of foreigners, the Manchus from Manchuria, implemented a much higher tax than usual. This made it even harder to afford food. Another problem was opium, which was creating an ever-growing number of indolent and impoverished people. Opium was extremely expensive and equally addictive, and had taken 60 million from the regional government's revenue, and to tackle this they implemented even higher taxes, which of course led to further hardship and anger. In 1842, China capitulated pathetically in the Opium War and signed a humiliating treaty. To top it all off, a drought fell over the province of Hunan, which decimated the land. In 1849, the Yangtze River flooded, which ruined that season's crops and put even more people on the streets and increased the number of unemployed. Cumulatively, the 1840s were a complete disaster for millions of Chinese. Vast areas of China were ripe for revolt and rebellion. All that was missing was a leader to direct this anger and frustration into a cause, and the Qing would be in dire peril. In 1850, many of the people of southern China found this leader in the persona of Hong Chi-kwan. In 1850, Hong Chi-kwan and the first leader of the Taiping Rebellion declared that he had received a new mandate from heaven after claiming to have had visions that he was the son of God and younger brother of Jesus, and was told it was his job to destroy the Manchu dynasty, or, more accurately, rid the world of demons and replace it with his own, a kingdom of heaven. This was a major threat to the Qing. Over the millennia, dynasties had claimed that they had been given a mandate from heaven to rule. If one dynasty was overthrown by another, the new dynasty would claim that the previous dynasty had lost its mandate to rule, and that its own success, usually achieved through war, was evidence that was now favored by God. Changes of dynasty often occurred during times of hardship or through conquest. Hardship, often a result of famine, flood, or war, was evidence that a dynasty was no longer in heaven's favor. Losses in battle would confirm it, and change in dynasty would occur. The Taiping Rebellion began amidst a particularly terrible time in China's history. There was a convergence of many disasters, the effects of which were compounded by poor government and an unpopular foreign regime. The Taiping, with the legitimacy of a new mandate of heaven, seized this opportunity to overthrow the Manchu, but despite fighting for 14 years, they failed in their endeavors and were in the end destroyed. There were many reasons for this failure. Despite their propitious beginnings, defeat in battle, internal dissension and corruption, and insurmountable logistical obstacles. Against them was the inherent and immense latent strength of the Chinese system of government, which also, at the right time, showed a capacity to resist and reform. Additionally, there was a powerful external force working against them, including a number of the great powers. Internal problems were one of the biggest obstacles in the way of the Taiping's success. Initially, they were internally sound. Morale was high, and the cooperation between leaders and the separate revolutionary groups was excellent. But as the revolution wore on, these distinctive traits that were so successful for the Taipings early on were beginning to disappear. Many leaders were becoming greedy, and wanted to live a more luxurious lifestyle than the one the regime they were fighting for could offer. This, in turn, led to arguments and communication failures between leaders and essentially made the Taiping fighting force far less successful. In addition to this, as the war went on, the Taiping revolutionary elan that was so strong initially had almost completely dissipated. Not too many of the Taipings were still buzzing with the excitement of the prospect of a new life promised by the heavenly king Hong Chi-Kwan. Most had become numb to this feeling over time. Another internal problem that arose was that with the expansion of the Taiping domain came a greater demand for more able persons and leaders to help control the newly acquired land. But due to a coup in 1856, many of the original leaders were now deceased, and new able persons were becoming much harder to come by. In addition to this, the majority of leaders that were in power were uneducated and illiterate, and so made no efforts to train the Taiping troops or at least educate them. The training of the Taiping army could have not necessarily won them the war, but could have at very least made it far more difficult for the Imperial Army to defeat the Taipings. In contrast to the lack of military leaders that the Taipings were suffering from, the Imperial Army, towards the later end of the revolution, from around 1860 onwards, had begun to make some military reforms, and Zheng Guofan, along with other military leaders, were learning how to bring together and build up an army made from an accumulation of local militias hired by some of the gentry for protection. These local militias were far better than the previous Imperial Army in almost every respect of the word. They were better equipped, had better training, and most importantly, were more disciplined and obedient to orders. Along with this new army the Qing had acquired, the Taipings were separating. The separate revolutionary movements that had initially been part of the Taiping movement had grown impatient and split off to do their own thing. This was a major opportunity for Zheng Guofan and his associates. The splitting up of major parts of the Taiping army left each movement vulnerable from attack. This is exactly the opportunity Zheng Guofan needed, and as an able strategist, Zheng was not going to miss his chance. As a whole, the Taiping army had relative safety in numbers against the attacks from the Imperial Army, but when they separated, that protection disappeared, and essentially Guofan was able to pick off the revolutionary movements one at a time. The final nail in the coffin for the Taipings was the involvement of Western powers, in particular France and Britain. The Western powers agreed to help the Imperial Army in a very limited way. They posted a few men on coastal cities so they didn't get captured and could still continue to perform trades between China and the West, but the most they did was create an army called the Ever Victorious Army, under the command of Frederick Townsend Ward. The Ever Victorious Army consisted of Chinese troops trained and led by European officers' corps. The main reason why the Western troops got themselves involved at all was because they felt it was in their best interest for the Qing to win the war because of the Tientsin Treaty made in 1858 after the Second Opium War, allowing Western powers many privileges they would not get if the Taipings won, so they decided to help. Though the help from Western powers was minimal, it was simply because they were doing the absolute minimum they had to do to push the Qing government over the line for victory. If needed be, the involvement of Western powers could have been far greater and essentially could have, from the beginning, cancelled any hopes the Taipings had of success simply because they would have been facing, even with the war at hand not in occurrence, a military power far superior to their own, in both strategy and potential, but also equipment and supplies. To overthrow an established regime always offered great challenges to any revolutionary movement. However, in the early years, the Taiping prospects were promising. The Qing were not ruling well, they taxed heavily, and had the disadvantage of being seen as foreigners. Additionally, the 1850s were a period of prolonged drought followed by flooding. This combined with a major problem of overpopulation resulted in much hardship for the people and much unpopularity for the Qing. These circumstances were ideal for a revolutionary movement, offering an alternative, and the Taiping seized the opportunity. They claimed a new mandate from heaven and offered a solution to the people's woes. However, they ultimately failed in their endeavors. Corruption and division grew within their ranks. They lost many of their best leaders and failed to secure the essential military victories. Unable to expand, they began to wither. Meanwhile, the Qing were able to call on an infrastructure and an access to resources that their opponents didn't have. They were also able to gain assistance from Western powers. Finally, and perhaps most importantly of all, they were able to find a powerful and influential leader in Zheng Guofan at just the right time, who was able to win vital military victories and help secure their mandate of heaven for the rest of the 19th century.